Hi there and welcome. Jonathan here. These talks are offered freely so that no one is ever denied access to these practices. Your support makes a big difference. If you feel inspired to make a donation, please go to jonathanfoust.com. Thank you. I spent a little time with my family this weekend, and I knew that I had this talk to write. So I asked my brother, I said, when was the most angry you've ever been? And he was really kind of hemming and hawing, and he said, it was really, really dumb, and I really regret it. And I couldn't get any details out of him, He really didn't want to talk about it. My brother's a forester in the state of Maine, and he spends a lot of time driving out, inspecting roads in the distant woods and so forth. And then after a pause, he said, I used to yell at the radio a lot. And I said, well, yeah, I do that too. If it's somewhat of a political persuasion, it really angers me, I'll just yell over them until they're done. And he said, yeah, well, I used to just scream at the radio. And I thought, wow, used to. So he doesn't do that anymore? So I thought, maybe he's got some secret technique. I said, so you used to scream at the radio, but since when? And he said, well, since I stopped listening to the radio. That's an excellent strategy for sidestepping anger. I wanted to talk tonight a little bit about how to work with this particular mind state, this sort of mind, body, emotional state when it arises. And as always, in 4 parts, first just acknowledging that anger happens. It's part of the human experience. And if you look closely at your anger, there's always a cause for it. And it can be very helpful to pause and look at that. And the third, part 3, is exploring how you can let it go. It's possible to let go of your anger. And then to talk about some of the practical strategies for how you can cultivate the possibility for more awareness of anger, like the triggers for anger, and maybe even lessening the experience of anger in your life. Oftentimes when I have a topic for the week, I usually have some life experience that sets me up for it in some humiliating way. And I was really happy this week because I had a fantastic week. I was leading a retreat up in New England, and then drove down to northern Pennsylvania on the old ancestral farm and was with my family. It was all really, really smooth. And oftentimes driving will aggravate me on some level, but I didn't get upset at anyone. It was pretty good. So I brought my inflatable paddleboard with me because at Kripalu Center they've got a beautiful 40-acre lake, and I got out there. So I was inflating it to go out on the river tomorrow. And I have a 12-volt pump, and I hook it up to my car battery, and I've done it many, many times. And the hood on my car is, usually I just release it, drop it, and it latches. But then a couple hours later, this is just 6 hours ago, I noticed that the hood wasn't latched on the Honda. So I went over and I lifted it and I, dropped it. It didn't latch. And then I lifted it and I forced it a little more. And then I got irritated and I sort of really jammed it down. And then I thought, something must be obstructing it. So I lifted it up and I looked, and there was my iPhone. So there you go. I had my humiliating experience for the week. And it's sort of like the acronym WAIT, why am I talking? To pause before you say something. I could have thought before the third time when I really smashed it down, maybe there's something here, but I didn't. So I'm curious, when was the last time you were angry? Anyone angry today? A couple of folks, yeah. How about in the last week you experienced some form of anger, irritation, ill will? Okay, good. So I'm not alone. Anger is often described as a weather system. It sort of comes through and takes over, and eventually it leaves, more or less. It falls into the category of the mind state of aversion. We speak of the 5 main mental states that make it impossible to be present. And aversion is a big one. It's anger, ill will, judgment, blame, hatred. Another being, craving, wanting, fantasy, planning. Another being worry and anxiety. The fourth being sloth and torpor, kind of heaviness, density, sleepiness, kind of a depressive state. And the fifth being doubt and self-criticism. So anger is experienced in the mind. Mentally it shows up as some form of anger, ill will, judgment, blame. But anger is also an energy. When you think of emotion, it's energy in motion. So when you experience anger, there's generally a lot of activity going on in your body at the same time. Most of the time, we're trying to avoid it. So we learn how to divert it, stuff it, ignore it, subvert it, maybe even channel it. You know how much housework you can get done when you're really angry? It's an energy. You can direct it in different ways. Generally, we find ourselves either scared of anger for the harm we might do to others or to ourselves, or we find ways to circumvent it to avoid kind of the inner harm that we do for ourselves. But it can be very, very helpful to look closely at this mind state. There's a tremendous amount you can unwind and actually find freedom inside this mind state when you take the time to really, really be with it. I did quite a bit of driving, and there's a podcast I got turned on to recently. It's called Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, and it's this very, very thoughtful fellow who dives into certain times in our history. And my grandfather fought in World War I, and I never really knew anything about his experience. So he has this series that he does. It's entitled A Blueprint for Armageddon, where he talks about, what led up to World War I. And my gosh, I had no idea of what had happened at that time and how these cycles just play through our culture of humanity over and over and over again. But he described in particular the Battle of Passchendaele in Belgium. The British were just about to launch their biggest series of coordinated attacks, through the whole war. And in August, it rained, and it just didn't stop. There were only 2 days where it stopped for any period of time whatsoever. And this was trench warfare. And so all the trenches filled up with water. And all the blast craters all filled with water. And the mud turned into a consistency that they described like cheesecake. And you would just, everything sunk into the mud. Even getting stuck into your knees could mean a slow death, that they wouldn't be able to get you out. So they would take these wood planks and crawl along these wood planks across basically this sea of mud. And if you slipped and fell into the mud, there was a very good chance that that would be the end for you. So there is this one, it's a rather graphic, but it really describes in many ways what lies at the root of anger. When you experience anger for yourself, or if you see another person really caught in anger. This is written by someone who was there. And we're talking about traversing these horrible battlefields. We splashed and slithered and dragged our feet from the pull of an invisible enemy, determined to suck us into its depths. Every few steps, someone would slide and stumble, and weighed down by rifle and equipment, rapidly sink into the squelching mess. Those nearest grabbed his arms, struggled against being themselves engulfed, and if humanly possible, dragged him out. When helpers floundered in as well and doubled the task, it became hopeless. All the straining efforts failed, and the swamp swallowed its screaming victims, and we had to be ordered to plod on dejectedly and fight this relentless enemy as stubbornly as we did those we could see. It happened that one of these leading us was Lieutenant Chamberlain, and so distraught had he become at the spectacle of men drowning in mud and the desperate attempts to rescue them that suddenly he began hysterically belaboring the shoulders of a sinking man with his swagger stick. We were horror-struck to see this most compassionate officer so unstrung as to resort to brutality, and our loud protests finally forced him to desist. So this Lieutenant Chamberlain was probably in his 20s and was responsible for the welfare of this entire unit. And what he was experiencing is something that lies at the root of anger. And that is a sense of fear and helplessness. And we all have a primal reaction to fear and helplessness. For some, it's aggression and anger. It's just an automatic, unconscious lashing out, as this young lieutenant acted. For others, their strategy is to disassociate. And for others, just freezing in fear. Like seeing a wild animal where it's an instinct just to freeze so it won't see you and continue on. But what they all have in common, and what always seems to lie as the root of anger, is an unmet need. You're needing something that isn't happening. So you can imagine this Lieutenant Chamberlain feeling completely out of control. A compassionate man, a respected leader, finding himself caught in anger, in blind rage. So I'd like to offer through this talk just a few short reflections, just an opportunity to kind of reflect a little bit on any recent experiences you might have had. So if you like, you can close your eyes. And you might just take some time to reflect back, just in recent history, maybe a time where you felt anger, or maybe a time when you witnessed anger around you. And you might take a moment just to kind of acknowledge how the body holds that thought, how it holds that memory. And in your own way, just to see it as objectively as you can. And then you might inquire, what in here is the unmet need? And if that need was met, how would it be different? And if you'd like, you can deepen the breath. This election has certainly given voice to a lot of anger. It's kind of a scary thing to see. Just the deep anger, the kind of the venomous voicing that's going on. On the other hand, there's something wonderful, I think, about it being called out. Because now it is just so much more seen and so much more visible that we as a culture are now witnessing more clearly than ever this shadow that has been sort of ever present, kind of under the surface. And I'm hoping that as that shadow comes to light, that as a culture we may be able to see it and in naming it, perhaps address it in some way. And I can't say exactly what the unmet need is there, but it certainly has something to do with certain people in our culture who feel disempowered, who feel less personal autonomy, who feel like they're losing something. They're losing their dominance, or at least the illusion of dominance. And certainly those in this changing planet, those that don't have the skill or the training to adapt to the new technology that's coming over the globe, a feeling of helplessness. So there's something very powerful about pausing to ask about the unmet need when you feel this rising of aversion, anger, judgment, blame. And it becomes an interesting aspect of how we can begin to turn our attention toward anger. We talk quite a bit about this acronym for transformation of RAIN, to recognize what's there, to realize what it is, to name it, and then to ask if you can allow it, if you can make room for it. And then the I, to investigate, to be intimate with what's there. And the N, to sort of nourish it with awareness, with non-judging presence, perhaps with empathy, compassion, and kindness. So when we experience anger, judgment, blame, ill will, hatred, there is an element of asking what the unmet need is, but there's another element which is to not even try to figure it out. And that is to look inside, to sense how your body holds it. And that can give you access to a deep somatic appreciation of your lifelong experience, your lifelong relationship with anger, judgment, and blame. It reveals itself to you. And it reveals the places that call for understanding and for compassion. So it's one thing to have the courage and the energy and the interest and the capacity to pause and look at this state inside yourself and in others. But then what? We recognize that anger happens to everyone. We recognize that it has a cause, it has some form of holding on, has some unmet need. But then the question is, how do you let it go? How do you let go of anger? I was thinking about this and I was reminded of, I'll have to give you an illustration of this. I was reminded of a wonderful technique for walking meditation. And this was first introduced by Eric Kolvig, who's He's now retired, but kind of a senior meditation teacher. And when he first presented this at a retreat we were offering, he said, I want to show you a technique that is guaranteed to calm your mind within 5 minutes. And I thought, whatever that is, I got to know what that is. So it's a form of walking meditation, but you count your steps as you're doing it. So you count 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and progressively up to 10. You've got to get very, very concentrated to do it. When you lose count, you start over again. So a woman I know, her 8 or 9-year-old daughter had a lot of anger issues, a lot of emotional issues. So she taught her daughter this technique when she was really upset. And what was so cute, she said she was talking her through it. So she's counting up, and so it's 8, 9, 10, and then she said to her daughter, "That's great, sweetie. Now do it backwards." So her daughter goes, 1, 1. No, count backwards. So she did this for a few minutes, and then she stopped and she turned to her mother and she said, "Mommy, it worked. I can't find my anger." I thought that was such a beautiful story. That's actually possible to kind of turn your attention to the present moment. And when you turn your attention to the present moment fully, that state that feels permanent will shift. That's one way. But another way is also to have tea with your anger when it occurs. And that when you have the presence of mind, when it feels safe, and when you feel anger, to really stop and inquire, what is this state? Many of us, when we feel anger, we have a certain fear, a certain conditioning. We're told it's not okay to feel it. We're also afraid of the harm that we might do. So I was spending some time with a woman who, after a long-term marriage, was going through a very, very painful divorce from her husband. And she had so much anger and just vitriol toward him, toward the whole experience. And when you experience strong mental, emotional states, there's a very, very fine line to walk. And it's best summed up as to neither indulge nor deny. If you indulge into anger, well, then there's an element of like holding on and clinging. But if you deny it, that's denying what's there as well. So we explored what it felt like, and for her, she could feel her entire body just filled with tension. Now, the interesting thing about anger is it's not just one emotion. So as she described the tightness in her chest and the kind of this churning hot feeling in her guts and the heat kind of coursing through her body, I asked her if there was a word, an emotional word that described it. And she said, this is anger. So I asked her to check back to verify if that was the right word. And then suddenly she said, no, this is disappointment. This is sadness. This is fear. This is grief. And suddenly it was like the anger was punctured and all the other components began to reveal themselves. And she was able to sort of name these other elements that made up this broad experience of anger. Just her disappointment at having what she thought was a lifelong relationship falling apart. And just the grief of the pain of her children to have to go through so much difficulty. The fear that she would never find another person, and on And what happened was it just began to soften, where she was able to feel what was under that anger was just a deep, deep sense of hurt and disappointment and shame. It's not that her experience was just healed in a moment, but she was able to come into a much more intimate relationship with what was there. And she began to realize that there was an unmet need that she had for support. An unmet need for giving herself the time to really grieve fully. And it was the beginning of a healing for her. Unfortunately, quite often I spend time with people who are going through a breakdown in a relationship, and it's just interesting to see the different ways we have of going through that. And again, they kind of fit under those categories of fight, flight, and freeze. Those who get caught in an endless cycle of blame cannot pull themselves out of blame and resentment and anger. I was once in a very intensive retreat, maybe 20 years ago, and this one woman kept asking questions and talking about her divorce, and obviously very, very painful. And at one point toward the end of the retreat, she probably asked 7 or 8 questions, and always referred them back to just her anger toward her husband. And the instructor said, how long ago was your divorce? And she said, 27 years. And it was so painful just to feel how her inability to let that go, she'd been carrying that for that long. Others were going to rush into disassociation by rushing into another relationship, or taking a new job, or moving, just anything to move away from the pain of it. And others take the strategy of freezing, kind of freezing out the other, shutting off the emotions. It can be very, very helpful to remember that when you feel anger, judgment, blame, ill will, anger, that it is subject to the laws of reality. The first being impermanence, that it's not a permanent state. And quite often when we feel that aversive quality, there is such a deep, deep anxiety that we'll be overwhelmed, that it won't ever go away. And it's an interesting thing to reflect on a time when you were really, really angry, but you're not anymore. Who were you then that was angry? But now it's just not there anymore. And it's kind of like sensations that come and go. Anger can come and go as well. So when you explore how to be with anger, remembering that acronym can be so helpful. Name it. When you can name it, you've begun to sever your identification with that. If it feels like you have the presence of mind to actually open to it, to allow it, to accept it, make room for it, there's a certain jujitsu that happens when you do that. And then if you have the presence of mind to really be with it, to investigate it. So it's helpful to remember that we're trained to be afraid of our anger. But when you can have tea with it, to really sit down with it, when you can locate it and explore how you're relating to it, and when you can sense how far back that goes, what are the roots of your anger? What triggers you? There's one thing that can be enormously helpful, if in meditation you're exploring anger, we always have a desire to control it. But what you can do is actually allow it to get big. It's a really wonderful practice. And I know my wife tells the story of working with someone who had a lot of anger. And she said, well, what if you let it get big? Does it feel safe? Like, okay, good. Well, could it be bigger than this house? And she said, yes, it just burned down the house. I said, well, could it sort of cover the United States? She said, yes, it just scorched North America. Well, what about the planet? The planet just burned up. Well, what about the universe? So she let it go all the way out to the edge of the universe, and then she said, okay, I'm done. So, when you contact anger, to really remember that there's something here about identifying the unmet need. There's the movie with Robert De Niro and Billy Crystal. Analyze This, was that the name of it? I remember just one scene where this De Niro's playing this mafiosi, who's seeing Billy Crystal, a psychiatrist, and he so wants to just waste a whole bunch of people, but he's going, anger is an unmet need, anger is an unmet need, anger is an unmet need. It's a good mantra to have at sometimes, though. Another interesting element to explore, and we'll do a little meditation before the end here, is just as you investigate what it feels like, how it's a weather system and it's impermanent. This is a really good timing for this talk. I'm waiting for the center just to get right overhead before we do the meditation. Another thing you can ask yourself when you're caught in anger or judgment, what are you believing? What's the story you're telling yourself? And that can be very, very helpful. And we'll take a look at that. The end part of this equation for some people is very challenging, and that is to nourish what's there with non-judging awareness. Sometimes it's helpful, as my wife often does, just to bring your hand to your heart as a gesture of care. Others find it more helpful that when you're experiencing something challenging, to remind yourself that other people feel this too. I find it to be very, very helpful. The other element when you're exploring anger is to ask yourself, if you weren't feeling anger, what would you have to feel? And oftentimes that question will reveal a vulnerability underneath it. So it's not so much about getting rid of anger as it is learning how to be with it. Letting it be your teacher so you can learn from it, where you can find freedom where you couldn't find it before. I think it's time for that meditation. So when you're ready, close your eyes. Deepen your breath. And take some time to reflect on a moment when you felt this wave of aversion, anger, judgment, blame, ill will, hatred. It doesn't have to be huge. And if you need a little more time, just raise your hand. Take a little time to go through the files. So you might take a moment now to, if you're a visual person, to bring it alive, either in a still image or maybe like a video clip. Is there anything auditory, words or tone of voice? And let yourself now turn to the kinesthetic. As you reflect on this, what does it feel like on the inside? Could you let this get big? this feeling. And you might explore some of the following questions. If they don't resonate for you, just let them slide by. What does this feel like on the inside? Is there a sense of how old, how far back this feeling, this felt sense goes? Does it feel okay to be with us? And if so, let the breath deepen just a little bit. If not, you can turn your attention elsewhere. Can you identify the unmet need? What are you wanting or needing that's not happening? If that need was met, what would that feel like inside? As you reflect on this experience, can you identify a core belief? What are you believing about this situation, about yourself? And do you know that to be true? Do you really know that to be true? And when you believe it, what does it feel like inside? The story you're believing about this. And again, just sense if you were to let that feeling get big or exaggerate a little bit. And now, who are you without that belief? Who are you without that story? In these final minutes, you might inquire if you could offer this some form of loving presence, some empathy or compassion or kindness. How does it shift or move or change? And regarding this experience, what advice do you have to give yourself? And if you were to do that, follow that, what would that feel like? And you might now deepen your breath. And in your own time, you can let your eyes open. There's so much more to explore in how to be in relationship with these strong mind states when they come through. The practice of of meditation itself, the training in meditation itself is so powerful. To train yourself in moment to moment to moment awareness. It's been said that a pure emotion lasts 90 seconds. But of course, when we resist, when we analyze, we prolong that for up to 27 years, if not more. The capacity to recognize, to make room, to be intimate with that weather system really means the difference between being caught in a perpetual cycle and finding freedom where it didn't exist before. As always, thanks for your support for the church and for me. And I think we're going to have to make a run for it. Have a safe trip home. And thank you for making your way out tonight. Blessings.